October 25th, 1944, 6:45 a.m., 70 miles off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines. Ensign Joseph McGraw, 22 years old, squinted through the morning haze from the cockpit of his Grumman FM-2 Wildcat aboard the escort carrier USS Kalinin Bay. What he saw made his blood run cold. Emerging from the mist like prehistoric monsters were the massive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships, their hulking forms bristling with the largest naval guns afloat. The Imperial Japanese Navy's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, had found the vulnerable escort carriers of Taffy 3. McGraw keyed his radio, his voice cracking with disbelief. "This is Wildcat 17. I have visual on multiple enemy capital ships bearing 030. Range approximately 20 miles and closing. Request confirmation." "These things are huge." The response came immediately from the air operations officer aboard Kalinin Bay. "Confirmed, 17. All aircraft are to launch immediately. Repeat, all aircraft launch now. This is not a drill. We are under attack by Japanese battleships." McGraw's hands trembled as he pushed his throttle forward. His FM-2 Wildcat, essentially a lightened version of the F-4F with a more powerful engine, was designed to defend escort carriers from Japanese torpedo bombers and submarines, not to attack the most heavily armoured warships ever built. The little fighter carried 2 250-pound bombs and 6 50-caliber machine guns. Against a battleship like the Yamato, with armour over 16 inches thick, it was like throwing pebbles at a tank. But McGraw and the other pilots launching that morning had no choice. Behind them were 6 escort carriers, ships built on merchant hulls with flight decks bolted on top, nicknamed jeep carriers or baby flat tops. These vessels, thin-skinned and slow, carried no armour to speak of. A single 14-inch shell from a Japanese battleship could penetrate them completely and emerge from the other side. The carriers held aviation fuel, ammunition, and nearly 2,000 men each. One good hit would turn them into floating infernos. What happened over the next 2.5 hours would become known as the Battle off Samar, the most unlikely naval engagement in history. A handful of escort carriers and destroyers faced the most powerful surface action group the Japanese Navy could assemble. The Americans were outgunned, outweighed, and completely outmatched. By every calculation, every tactical analysis, every principle of naval warfare, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated within 30 minutes. Instead, they held on for 2.5 hours and ultimately drove off the Japanese force, saving the invasion of Leyte Gulf. The key to their survival was not the destroyers' suicidal torpedo runs, though those were crucial. It was not the carriers' desperate evasive manoeuvres, though those bought precious time. It was the pilots in their Wildcats, Avengers and other aircraft who, armed with nothing more than machine guns, tiny bombs, and sheer determination, convinced the Japanese admiral that he was facing fleet carriers protected by a much larger force. This is the story of how farmers' sons from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, flying obsolete fighters from doomed ships, stopped the Japanese Navy's last great offensive. This is the story of the day the Wildcats saved Leyte Gulf. To understand the impossible odds facing Taffy 3, you need to understand what escort carriers were. These ships, designated CVE, but nicknamed by their crews as combustible, vulnerable, expendable, were never meant to fight surface engagements. They were built for anti-submarine warfare, for supporting amphibious landings, for ferry duty. The Casablanca-class carriers that made up Taffy 3 displaced 8,000 tons compared to the 27,000 tons of a fleet carrier like the Essex class. Their maximum speed was 19 knots. The Japanese battleships closing on them could make 27 knots. The carriers literally could not run away. Their defensive armament was laughable for ships about to face battleship-grade firepower. Each carrier mounted a single 5-inch gun and a collection of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons. These guns were designed to shoot down aircraft, not to engage armoured warships. Against the Yamato's 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship, the 5-inch pop guns might as well have been slingshots. But the carriers did have one advantage: their aircraft. Each escort carrier in Taffy 3 carried approximately 28 aircraft, a mix of FM-2 Wildcats for fighter defence, TBM Avengers for torpedo and bombing attacks, and a handful of other types. These aircraft, if properly armed and coordinated, could theoretically inflict serious damage on enemy ships. The problem was that on the morning of October 25, 1944, they were not properly armed. Taffy 3 had been assigned ground support duty for the troops landing on Leyte. Their aircraft were loaded for attacking Japanese positions ashore, not for naval combat. The Avengers carried 500-pound general-purpose bombs designed to blow up bunkers and supply dumps, not armour-piercing weapons that could penetrate a battleship's deck. Many Wildcats carried nothing but ammunition for their machine guns, having already dropped their bombs on earlier missions. Some aircraft had no ammunition at all, having expended everything in previous sorties and not yet been rearmed. When the Japanese ships appeared on the horizon, the air operations officers faced an impossible decision. They could wait to properly arm their aircraft with the few anti-ship weapons available: torpedoes, armour-piercing bombs, depth charges that might work against thin-skinned ships. But waiting meant the Japanese would close the range, and at 20 miles the enemy guns would soon be in range of the carriers. Or they could launch everything immediately, properly armed or not, and hope that the sheer number of attacking aircraft would slow the Japanese advance. They chose to launch. Ensign McGraw was one of the first pilots airborne. His Wildcat carried two 250-pound bombs, barely sufficient to damage a destroyer, let alone a battleship. But he and his wingman, Ensign Robert Huffel, pointed their fighters toward the approaching Japanese fleet and pushed their throttles to maximum power. Behind them, more aircraft were launching from all 6 carriers of Taffy 3, the Fanshawe Bay, Kalinin Bay, Kit Kun Bay, Gambier Bay, White Plains, and St. Lo. The scene on the flight decks was controlled chaos. Aircraft handlers pushed planes toward the catapults while ordnance crews loaded whatever weapons were available. Some Avengers were loaded with depth charges, anti-submarine weapons that were worthless against battleship armour, but might damage lighter ships. Other aircraft were simply pushed onto the deck with empty bomb racks, their pilots ordered to make dummy runs to distract the Japanese gunners. As McGraw climbed to 5,000 feet, he got his first clear look at what they were facing. The formation stretched across miles of ocean, massive ships arrayed in perfect formation, their bows cutting white foam as they charged toward the carriers at maximum speed. In the centre of the formation was the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons fully loaded and mounting 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl a 3,200-pound shell over 25 miles. Accompanying the Yamato were 3 more battleships, Nagato, Kongo and Haruna, each mounting 14 or 16-inch main batteries. The heavy cruisers, 6 of them, carried 8-inch guns that could rip through the escort carriers like tissue paper. And surrounding these capital ships were destroyers whose 5-inch guns matched the largest weapons the American carriers possessed. McGraw's tactical training, all of it, focused on attacking enemy aircraft. He had practiced deflection shooting against other fighters, had learned to lead bombers by the proper distance, had studied the vulnerable points of Japanese aircraft. Nothing in his training prepared him for attacking a battleship. The standard doctrine for aerial attacks on capital ships called for coordinated strikes, multiple aircraft coming from different directions simultaneously to overwhelm the ship's anti-aircraft defences. The attack should be pressed home to point-blank range to ensure hits. Torpedoes should be dropped in spreads to bracket the target. Bombs should be released from high altitude to achieve maximum penetration of deck armour. None of this was possible. The American aircraft were launching piecemeal as they became available, not in coordinated waves. The Wildcats, designed as fighters, had no bomb sights and could only attack in low-level runs where accuracy was poor. Most aircraft carried the wrong ordnance for the targets they faced, but they attacked anyway. McGraw rolled into his dive at 6,000 feet, pushing the nose of his Wildcat over until the battleship Nagato filled his windscreen. Anti-aircraft fire, thick black puffs of exploding shells, began appearing around him immediately. The Japanese gunners, veterans of years of Pacific combat, knew how to lead a diving aircraft. McGraw jinked left and right, trying to throw off their aim while keeping the battleship centred in his gun sight. At 2,000 feet he released his bombs and pulled hard on the stick, feeling the G-forces press him into his seat as the Wildcat arced away from the ship. He never saw where his bombs hit, didn't know if they hit at all. The important thing was that for the few seconds of his attack run, some of the Nagato's anti-aircraft guns were focused on him instead of on the carriers. Behind McGraw, more Wildcats dove on the Japanese formation. Ensign Heffel attacked a cruiser, his bombs straddling the ship but causing no visible damage. Lieutenant James Murphy, flying from the St. Lo, emptied his machine guns into the superstructure of a destroyer, killing the gun crews but failing to stop the ship. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, leading a division of 4 Avengers, dropped their 500-pound bombs on the cruiser Tone, achieving at least one hit that started a fire on the aft deck. It was a pinprick, nothing that would stop a heavy cruiser, but it was a hit. From the Japanese perspective, the sudden appearance of so many attacking aircraft was alarming. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding Center Force from the bridge of the Yamato, had no idea what he was facing. His reconnaissance had been abysmal throughout the approach to Leyte Gulf. He believed he was attacking a force of fleet carriers, the big fast carriers that had decimated the Japanese Navy at Midway and in the Philippine Sea. The appearance of aircraft confirmed his assumption. Why else would carriers have so many planes? The fact that the attacking aircraft seemed poorly coordinated and were using ineffective weapons didn't register. In the confusion of battle, with dozens of planes swarming around his ships, Kurita assumed he was facing the vanguard of a much larger air group, and that properly armed torpedo bombers and dive bombers would follow shortly. This misidentification would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. Kurita's plan had been to overwhelm the American carriers with rapid, coordinated fire from all his ships, to close the range quickly and use his superior speed to prevent the carriers from escaping. But if he was facing fleet carriers, they would have much longer range than escort carriers. They could launch airstrikes from 150 miles away. Kurita needed to sink them quickly before they could launch their full air groups. The attacks by McGraw and the other pilots, ineffective as they were in terms of damage, convinced Kurita he was already under attack from multiple carrier air groups. Aboard the Kalinin Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, watched the Japanese formation close with a growing sense of doom. His carriers were running south at their maximum 19 knots, laying smoke screens to hide their movements, but the Japanese were gaining steadily. His escorts, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, were already moving to launch torpedo attacks in a desperate attempt to slow the enemy advance. But Sprague knew his little ships couldn't stop a force this size. His only real hope was that the aircraft, his aircraft, could buy enough time for help to arrive from other carrier groups or from Admiral Halsey's fast carriers, which was somewhere to the north. The problem was that help was hours away, and the Japanese would be in gun range within 30 minutes. Sprague's air operations officer, Commander Richard Roberts, was coordinating the aircraft launches and attacks as fast as humanly possible. Every plane that could fly was being thrown at the enemy. But Roberts faced a nightmare of logistics. Aircraft returning from their first attacks needed to be rearmed and refueled, but the carriers were under fire, maneuvering violently to avoid shells and filling their decks with smoke. Landing aircraft in these conditions was suicidal. The pilots would have to circle until the situation stabilized or until they ran out of fuel. At 7:15 a.m. the Japanese opened fire with their main batteries. The first salvo from the Yamato's 18.1-inch guns was targeted at the Kalinin Bay. The shells, each weighing more than a small car, created waterspouts over 300 feet high when they hit the ocean, taller than the carrier's mast. The dye loaded in the shells to help Japanese spotters identify which ship's shells were landing turned the water around the carrier bright red, yellow and green. It looked like something from a surreal painting, coloured geysers erupting around a desperately manoeuvring ship trailing smoke. Ensign McGraw, circling at 8,000 feet after his first attack, watched the shells landing and realised with sick certainty that if any of those shells hit, the carrier was finished. The armour on an escort carrier's flight deck was 3/4 of an inch thick, designed to stop bomb fragments, not artillery shells. An 18-inch shell would pass through the flight deck, through the hangar deck, through the hull, and out the bottom without even noticing the ship was there. McGraw checked his fuel gauge. He had maybe 20 minutes before he'd have to land or ditch in the ocean. His bombs were gone. All he had left were his 650 caliber machine guns, each loaded with approximately 200 rounds of ammunition. Against a battleship it was nothing. Machine gun bullets would bounce off armour plate like raindrops. But McGraw descended anyway, lining up on the cruiser Chickamauer, and opened fire. His tracers arced across the sky and sparkled against the cruiser's superstructure. He could see his rounds hitting, could see them ricocheting off, doing no real damage. But he also saw the cruiser's anti-aircraft guns swivel to track him, saw the gunners abandon their larger weapons to man the machine guns defending against his attack. For 30 seconds, those guns weren't shooting at the carriers. That was worth something. Other pilots were making the same calculation. Lieutenant Raymond Moore, out of bombs and nearly out of fuel, made repeated strafing runs on a destroyer, not because he thought he could sink it, but because every second the destroyer's crew spent tracking him and firing at him was a second they weren't shooting at the carriers. Ensign John Puccio, flying an Avenger with no weapons at all, having expended everything on earlier ground support missions, flew simulated attack runs on the battleship Congo, diving toward the ship as if preparing to drop a bomb or torpedo, then pulling away at the last second. The Japanese gunners couldn't know his bomb bay was empty. They had to defend against the threat. Puccio made 6 such runs before his fuel ran out, and he had to ditch alongside one of the destroyers. By 7:30 a.m., the situation was desperate. The Japanese were now in range with all their weapons. Shells from battleships, cruisers and destroyers were falling around the carriers in a near-continuous rain. The Gambia Bay, slowest of the carriers and closest to the enemy, was being hit repeatedly. Smoke poured from her hull. Her speed dropped to 11 knots, then 8. Then she stopped altogether, dead in the water. The Japanese cruisers closed in for the kill. Aboard the other carriers, sailors watched helplessly as the Gambia Bay absorbed hit after hit. She rolled over and sank at 9:07 a.m., the first and only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by surface gunfire. Over 800 men went into the water, but while the Gambia Bay died, the other carriers survived, and it was the aircraft that kept them alive. The Japanese formation had become scattered. Instead of maintaining their tight, coordinated formation that would have allowed them to concentrate fire, the ships had broken formation to avoid air attacks, to chase individual carriers, to maneuver against torpedo attacks from the destroyers. Kurita's flagship, the Yamato, had turned away from a spread of torpedoes launched by the destroyer USS Johnston, taking the battleship north and out of the main action for crucial minutes. Other ships had turned east or west, trying to avoid the swarms of attacking aircraft. The neat professional advance that should have overwhelmed Taffy 3 in 30 minutes had turned into a confused melee. Lieutenant Commander John Bridge, leading a group of Avengers from the Kitken Bay, found a heavy cruiser separated from the main formation, the Chokai. Bridge's Avengers were carrying 500-pound general-purpose bombs, wrong for attacking a cruiser, but they attacked anyway. One bomb hit, penetrating into the cruiser's engine room not because it was armor-piercing, but because it was lucky. The explosion ruptured steam lines and disabled 2 boilers. The Chokai's speed dropped. She fell further behind. Later, she would be finished off by another air attack and would sink that afternoon. The crucial moment came at approximately 8 a.m. Admiral Kurita, on the bridge of the Yamato, was receiving a flood of confusing reports. His ships reported being under continuous air attack from what appeared to be hundreds of aircraft. The attacks were coming from all directions. Some of his cruisers had been hit and damaged. The formation was scattered across miles of ocean. The American carriers, instead of being destroyed quickly, were still maneuvering and still launching aircraft. In Kurita's mind, formed by years of Japanese naval doctrine that emphasized decisive fleet engagements, this made no sense. If these were escort carriers, lightly defended and slow, they should have been sunk by now. The fact that they survived meant they must be fleet carriers, heavily defended and capable of launching massive airstrikes. Where were their main air groups? Where were the properly armed torpedo bombers that could cripple his battleships? Kurita convinced himself that he had stumbled into a trap, that the carriers he could see were bait, and that the real American fleet was nearby, preparing to annihilate his force with overwhelming air power. At 8:20 a.m., Admiral Kurita ordered his ships to break off the attack and retire northward. The order was met with shock by his ship commanders. They were winning. They could see the American carriers smoking and listing. They were in gun range. Victory was minutes away. But Kurita's flagship hoisted the signal flags, and the Japanese Navy, disciplined to the point of suicide, obeyed. The massive warships turned away from the carriers and headed north. Ensign McGraw, circling at 3,000 feet on his last drops of fuel, couldn't believe what he was seeing. The Japanese were leaving. The battleships that had seemed unstoppable, that had shrugged off bombs and torpedoes and machine gun fire, were turning away. He keyed his radio. Wildcat 17 to Kalinin Bay. The enemy ships are withdrawing. Repeat, Enemy ships are withdrawing northward. Request instructions." The response came from Commander Roberts, and McGraw could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "Understood, 1-7. Continue to attack until you are out of fuel or ammunition. We need them to keep running." McGraw laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. He had no fuel, he had almost no ammunition. But he descended anyway, lined up on the stern of a cruiser, and fired his last 50 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition at the retreating ship. The bullets hit. They did nothing. But the cruiser kept running. The battle was over, but the cost was still being tallied. Taffy 3 had lost the escort carrier Gambier Bay and 2 destroyers, the USS Johnston and USS Hall, which had been sunk in their suicidal attacks on the Japanese formation. A third destroyer, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort nicknamed Sammy B, would sink later from accumulated damage. Over 1,500 American sailors were dead or in the water, but they had stopped the Japanese Navy. Center Force, the most powerful surface action group Japan could assemble at this stage of the war, had been turned back by 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and a collection of obsolete aircraft armed mostly with weapons that couldn't hurt them. The Japanese losses were comparatively light in terms of ships sunk during the battle itself, but the damage was catastrophic in strategic terms. 3 heavy cruisers were sunk or fatally damaged. Multiple other ships had been hit and would require months of repairs. But more importantly, the battle had shattered Japanese confidence. Kurita had turned away from a victory that was within his grasp because he believed he was facing a force much larger than Taffy 3. That belief was created by the pilots in their Wildcats and Avengers who, despite being outgunned and improperly armed, had attacked with such ferocity and in such numbers that the Japanese were convinced they faced fleet carriers. Post-war interviews with Japanese officers revealed the crucial role the aircraft played. Captain Toshikazu Omai, operations officer for Center Forces, stated, "We believed we were under attack by at least 3 or 4 fleet carrier air groups. The number of aircraft, the intensity of the attacks, the coordination, all suggested a much larger force than we actually faced. We did not realize until after the war that these were escort carriers with limited aircraft. Admiral Kurita believed, and I agreed, that we had encountered the main American carrier force and that continuing the attack would result in the annihilation of Center Force." This assessment was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what they had faced. Taffy 3's carriers had launched approximately 160 aircraft during the battle, but many of these planes made multiple sorties. Pilots who ran out of ammunition or fuel would land on any available carrier, even those from other task units, rearm as quickly as possible and return to the attack. The Japanese counted aircraft, not sorties, and assumed each plane they saw was from a different carrier air group. When Lieutenant Commander James Murphy made 4 separate attack runs, the Japanese logged it as 4 different aircraft. This multiplication effect made Taffy 3's air power appear much larger than it actually was. The Wildcats' role in this deception was crucial. The FM-2 variant, while less capable than the newer F-6F Hellcat that equipped fleet carriers, looked similar enough from a distance that Japanese spotters couldn't distinguish between them. When Admiral Kurita saw Wildcats attacking his ships, he saw what he expected to see from fleet carriers. The fact that these Wildcats were armed with light bombs or nothing at all, that they were making uncoordinated attacks, that they were often simply strafing with machine guns, didn't register as significant in the chaos of battle. What registered was the sheer number of aircraft and the ferocity of their attacks. The pilots themselves, men like Ensign McGraw, had no grand strategy in mind. They were not thinking about deceiving the Japanese admiral, or about the strategic implications of their attacks. They were thinking about survival, theirs and their ships. They attacked because those were their orders. They attacked because their friends were on those carriers. They attacked because stopping meant watching those carriers sink. The fact that their attacks were largely ineffective in terms of actual damage inflicted never entered their minds. They had weapons, they had targets, they attacked. Lieutenant Robert Weatherholt, flying an Avenger from the White Plains, described his experience in a post-war interview. "I made 3 attack runs during the battle. The first time I had a depth charge, completely useless against a battleship, but I dropped it anyway. Might have rattled their dishes. The second run, I had nothing but my turret gun, 50 caliber machine gun operated by my gunner. We strafed a cruiser. I watched our bullets bounce off like bees. The third run, I was out of ammunition completely, but I flew the approach anyway. dove on a destroyer like I was going to bomb it, pulled up at the last second. The destroyer turned hard to avoid what they thought was coming. For maybe 30 seconds, that destroyer wasn't shooting at our carriers. That's what we were doing, buying seconds. 30 seconds here, a minute there. It added up. Those seconds and minutes added up to 2.5 hours, long enough for the Japanese to lose their nerve, long enough for Kurita to convince himself he was facing a trap, long enough for Taffy 3 to survive. The mathematics of the battle are stark. The Japanese center force displaced approximately 300,000 tons of warships, mounting over 100 major caliber guns. Taffy 3 displaced less than 60,000 tons, mounting exactly 6 5-inch guns on the carriers themselves. The destroyers and destroyer escorts added perhaps another 10,000 tons and 20 more 5-inch guns. On paper, it wasn't even a contest. It was a massacre waiting to happen. What changed the mathematics was air power, even air power armed with the wrong weapons. A battleship's armour is designed to defeat shells fired in relatively flat trajectories. The heavy armour belts protecting the hull, the thick deck armour, the armoured turrets and conning towers, all are positioned to defend against gunfire. But armour is heavy, and you can only put it where you expect to be hit. The tops of turrets have thinner armour. The superstructure, where radar and fire control equipment must function, cannot be heavily armoured. These are the areas where aircraft attack, diving from above or skimming in at wave top height. Even machine gun bullets, if they hit unarmoured areas, can kill personnel and damage equipment. The destroyer Yamagumo, part of Center Force's screen, was disabled not by bombs or torpedoes, but by strafing attacks from Wildcats that killed her captain and destroyed her bridge fire control systems. She could still float, her engine still worked, her guns still functioned, but she couldn't fight effectively. She withdrew from the battle not because she was sinking, but because she was blind and leaderless. This is what machine guns could accomplish, not sinking ships, but mission-killing them, making them ineffective. The cruiser Kumano took a torpedo from an Avenger piloted by Lieutenant Thomas Lupo. The torpedo was an old Mark 13, notoriously unreliable, and Lupo didn't expect it to even run properly, much less hit. But it did both. The explosion tore open the cruiser's bow, and although it didn't sink her, it reduced her speed to 14 knots. She fell out of formation and eventually limped back to base, taking no further part in the battle. One torpedo, dropped by one aircraft, removed 13,000 tons of cruiser from the fight. These incremental degradations of Japanese combat power, individually insignificant, collectively decisive, were the real achievement of the Taffy 3 air groups. They didn't sink the Japanese fleet, but they hurt it, slowed it, disrupted it, and most importantly, scared it. The Japanese, veterans of years of combat against increasingly effective American air power, knew what coordinated carrier airstrikes could do. They had experienced it at Midway, in the Philippine Sea, during countless smaller engagements. They knew that once American dive bombers and torpedo bombers got within striking range, Japanese ships died. The attacks they faced off Samar, desperate and poorly coordinated as they were, looked like the prelude to such a strike. Kurita was waiting for the real attack, the properly armed and coordinated strike that would cripple his force. He didn't know that what he was seeing was all the Americans had. When he ordered the withdrawal, he was retreating from a threat that existed only in his mind, a threat created by pilots in Wildcats and Avengers who had no business stopping battleships but did it anyway. The pilot losses during the battle were remarkably light considering the intensity of the combat. Taffy 3 lost approximately 18 aircraft shot down during the battle, with another dozen damaged beyond repair. Most of the downed aircrews were rescued, either by destroyers or by float planes that landed in the ocean to pick up men from the water. This low loss rate reflected both the skill of the pilots and the fact that the Japanese anti-aircraft fire, while intense, was designed to stop bombers approaching at medium altitude, not fighters making high-speed low-level runs or diving from 10,000 feet. Ensign McGraw survived the battle. He ditched his Wildcat alongside the destroyer USS Heermann when his fuel finally ran out, was pulled from the water, given coffee and a blanket, and was back flying combat missions within a week. His Wildcat No. 17 was left where it ditched, too damaged and waterlogged to recover. McGraw flew 47 more combat missions before the war ended, but he never forgot October 25, 1944. In a 1983 interview he said, "I always thought it was funny that they put us in the history books. We didn't do anything special. We just flew our planes and shot at the enemy. That's what you're supposed to do. The special thing was that we were in the wrong place with the wrong weapons against the wrong enemy, and somehow we won anyway. That's not skill. That's luck and stubbornness. Mostly stubbornness. The Battle off Samar had immediate strategic consequences. The Japanese never again attempted a major surface action in the Philippines. Center Force's withdrawal meant the landing beaches at Leyte Gulf remained secure, allowing American forces to complete the invasion without interference from naval bombardment. The Japanese Navy, which had gambled everything on disrupting the Leyte landings, had failed. Within months, most of the ships that fought off Samar would be sunk by air attacks or submarine torpedoes. The Yamato herself would die under overwhelming air attack in April 1945, torpedoed and bombed by hundreds of aircraft from American fleet carriers. The battleship that had turned away from Taffy 3 would be sunk by the very weapon system she had feared. The battle vindicated the American emphasis on carrier aviation. Even small carriers, improperly armed and in the wrong place, had defeated a battleship force through sheer persistence and aggressive tactics. The Japanese emphasis on battleships and gun duels looked increasingly obsolete. Air power, properly applied, could defeat any surface force. But the battle also revealed uncomfortable truths about American aviation. The Wildcats and Avengers that fought off Samar were obsolescent designs, effective but not cutting edge. The FM-2 Wildcat was lighter and faster than the original F-4F, but it was still based on a 1935 design. Against Japanese fighters, it held its own. Against battleships, it was inadequate. The fact that inadequate weapons had won the battle was lucky, not a vindication of using inadequate weapons. After Samar, the Navy accelerated deployment of better aircraft to escort carriers. The FM-2 remained in service, but it was increasingly supplemented by F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, fighters with heavier bomb loads and better performance. The TBM Avenger received improved torpedoes and heavier bombs. Doctrine changed to emphasize proper armament for naval combat, not just ground support. The Navy had gotten away with improvisation once. They would not count on getting away with it again. The pilots who fought off Samar received recognition, though less than the destroyer crews whose attacks had been more visibly heroic. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable received the Navy Cross for pressing home attacks against heavy cruisers under intense fire. Lieutenant Robert Weatherholt received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Dozens of other pilots received air medals, but the real recognition came from their peers, from other pilots who understood what they had accomplished. To fly against battleships with machine guns required either courage or insanity or both. The Taffy 3 pilots had both. The Japanese never understood what had happened off Samar until after the war. Admiral Kurita died in 1977, still convinced he had made the right decision to withdraw. In his memoirs he wrote, "The American carriers were too well defended. Their air power was too strong." To continue the attack would have resulted in the destruction of center force without achieving any significant results. The carriers would have escaped, and we would have lost everything. He never learned that the carriers could barely escape, that their air power was a shell game, that victory had been within his grasp. The knowledge might have killed him. The escort carriers that survived October 25, 1944, continued fighting for the rest of the war. Kalinin Bay, hit by multiple shells during the battle, was repaired and returned to service. She launched aircraft supporting operations in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Kitkun Bay participated in strikes against the Japanese home islands. White Plains, whose aircraft had helped drive off center force, ended the war as a training carrier. These small ships, built as stopgaps and expected to serve briefly before being replaced by fleet carriers, turned out to be essential to winning the Pacific War. They provided air cover for every amphibious landing, hunted submarines, delivered aircraft to forward bases, and when necessary fought off battleships. The FM-2 Wildcat, dismissed by some as obsolete, served until the war's end. Its combination of reliability, ease of maintenance, and adequate performance made it ideal for escort carrier operations where deck space was limited and maintenance facilities primitive. Over 4,700 FM-2s were built, most seeing service on escort carriers. The last Wildcat was not retired until 1952, serving with reserve units long after more modern fighters had replaced it in frontline service. For a design that originated in the 1930s, the Wildcat had remarkable longevity. Today, The Battle off Samar is studied in military academies as an example of how inferior forces can defeat superior opponents through aggressive tactics and exploitation of enemy mistakes. The aircraft attacks, while not decisive in terms of ships sunk, were decisive in terms of psychological impact. They convinced the Japanese they faced a larger force than actually existed, and that conviction led to retreat. This is the essence of naval deception, making the enemy believe something that isn't true and forcing them to react to that false belief. The Taffy 3 pilots accomplished this deception not through any planned operation, but through simple aggression and persistence. They attacked because they had no choice, and their attack succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. There are memorials to the battle off Samar. The escort carrier USS Gambier Bay and the destroyers lost in the battle are honoured at the Naval Academy and at various locations around the country. But there is no memorial specifically for the air crews, the pilots and gunners who flew against battleships with machine guns. They are included in general memorials to naval aviation, but their specific achievement, stopping an entire fleet with inadequate weapons, is not separately commemorated. Perhaps it doesn't need to be. The battle itself is the memorial. The fact that they fought and won against impossible odds is the only commemoration that matters. Ensign Joseph McGraw returned to Iowa after the war and became a crop duster, flying small agricultural aircraft for 40 years. He never spoke much about October 25, 1944, even to his family. His son once asked him if he'd been scared during the battle. McGraw's answer was typically understated. Scared doesn't cover it. Terrified. Absolutely convinced I was going to die. But everyone else was just as scared and they were still flying, still attacking, so I figured I should too. You can't let your buddies down. That simple philosophy, applied by hundreds of pilots on that October morning, saved Leyte Gulf and changed history. The Japanese planned to destroy the landing beaches and drive the Americans back into the sea. Instead, they ran from escort carriers because men like McGraw wouldn't quit. The Wildcats stopped the battleships not with their weapons, but with the determination of the men flying them. That determination, multiplied across an entire air group, across 6 carriers, proved more powerful than 18-inch guns. The thunder of those guns is long silent, but the courage of the pilots who faced them echoes still. The full strategic picture of what happened off Samar on October 25, 1944 becomes clear only when you understand what the Japanese were trying to accomplish and how close they came to succeeding. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not one battle, but 4 separate engagements spread across hundreds of miles of ocean, all occurring within a 3-day period. The Japanese plan, designated Shogo or Victory Operation, was their last chance to inflict a decisive defeat on the American Navy and potentially turn the tide of the war. The plan was bold, complex, and required precise timing and coordination between multiple forces that had been scattered across the Pacific. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, had devised a strategy that relied on deception. The Japanese would use their remaining aircraft carriers, now nearly empty of planes after catastrophic losses in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as bait to lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the landing beaches. Once Halsey took the bait and sailed north to attack the carriers, 3 separate surface forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions and destroy the invasion fleet. The southern force would approach through Surigao Strait. The smaller second striking force would follow behind. And the powerful center force, built around the super-battleships Yamato and Musashi, would thread through San Bernardino Strait and fall upon the undefended landing beaches from the north. The plan nearly worked. On October 24th, American submarines spotted center force transiting the Sibuyan Sea, heading for San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Halsey launched massive airstrikes against the Japanese ships. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes from the fleet carriers attacked throughout the day. The super-battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, absorbed an incredible punishment before finally sinking. Estimates vary, but she took at least 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before capsizing and going down with over 1,000 of her crew. The attacks appeared to have stopped center force. The Japanese formation turned away, apparently retreating. Halsey's pilots reported the enemy was beaten, running for home. But Admiral Kurita had not given up. After dark, once American aircraft could no longer track his movements, he turned his ships around and headed again for San Bernardino Strait. His force was battered but still powerful. He had lost the Musashi and several cruisers had been damaged, but he still commanded 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and numerous lighter ships. More importantly, he knew that if he could reach the American landing beaches, the hundreds of transport ships and supply vessels anchored there would be helpless targets. A few hours of unopposed bombardment could destroy months of supplies and kill tens of thousands of troops. It might not win the war, but it would make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they might seek a negotiated peace rather than continue the bloody advance toward Japan. Meanwhile, Halsey had taken the bait. Japanese carriers had been spotted to the north, and Halsey, who had been criticised for being too cautious earlier in the war, was determined not to let them escape. He took his entire fleet, all 6 fleet carriers, 8 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, and steamed north to destroy the Japanese carriers. He left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. The Japanese plan was working perfectly. When Kurita's center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait in the early morning hours of October 25th, there was nothing between them and the landing beaches except Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers that happened to be in the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, had received no warning that Japanese battleships were nearby. His carriers were positioned to provide air support for the troops ashore on Leyte. His pilots had been flying ground support missions, attacking Japanese artillery positions and supply dumps. When the lookout spotted pagoda masts on the horizon at 6:45 a.m., Sprague initially thought they must be friendly ships, perhaps Halsey's battleships returning from the north. The idea that Japanese battleships could be this close to the carriers was so impossible that it took several minutes for the reality to penetrate. By the time Sprague accepted what his eyes were telling him, the Japanese were already within gun range and opening fire. Sprague's first actions were defensive. He ordered his carriers to turn south and run at maximum speed. He ordered them to make smoke, both from their funnels and from chemical smoke generators, to hide their positions. He radioed for help, broadcasting in the clear that his force was under attack by Japanese battleships. Then he did the only other thing he could do. He ordered his destroyers to attack and his aircraft to launch. The destroyers' attack has been well documented. The USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Samuel B. Roberts charged directly at the Japanese battleships and cruisers, ships that outweighed them by factors of 10 or 20 to 1, and launched torpedoes at point-blank range. It was suicide, and they knew it. All 3 ships would be sunk, but their attacks disrupted the Japanese formation and bought time for the carriers. What has been less documented is the complexity of the air operations that morning. Launching aircraft from a carrier under fire while making radical evasive maneuvers is extraordinarily difficult. The carriers had to briefly steady their course to allow aircraft to take off, which meant becoming predictable targets for Japanese gunners. The flight deck crews, working in the open, were completely exposed to shell fire and shrapnel. Yet they continued pushing aircraft to the catapults, arming them with whatever weapons were available, and launching them into a sky filled with shells. Lieutenant Richard Robbie, operations officer aboard the Gambier Bay, described the launch process in his after-action report. The ship was manoeuvring radically. We would heel over in a hard turn, shells landing all around us, then straighten out just long enough to launch 1 or 2 aircraft. The deck crews were incredible. They'd be thrown to the deck by the ship's movements, pick themselves up, and keep working. We had shells landing within 50 yards. The splashes were drenching the flight deck. 1 near miss peppered the deck with shrapnel. 3 men were wounded, but they refused to leave their stations. We launched 11 aircraft in 15 minutes under conditions that would normally make flight operations impossible. The aircraft that launched faced immediate challenges. The Japanese were between the carriers and the direction most pilots would normally fly, which meant flying directly toward the enemy ships to gain altitude and organize into attack formations. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, not just from dedicated anti-aircraft guns, but from the main batteries of battleships and cruisers, which were firing special shells designed to create airbursts that could knock down aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Richard Fowler, leading a division of Avengers from the Kitken Bay, recalled that climbing through the anti-aircraft fire was like flying through a thunderstorm where the lightning was actively trying to kill you. The ordnance situation was chaotic. Some aircraft had been armed for ground support missions and carried general-purpose bombs useful against buildings or troops, but nearly useless against armoured ships. Other aircraft had been in the process of being rearmed when the Japanese appeared, and were loaded with whatever was handy. Several Avengers carried depth charges, anti-submarine weapons that required the aircraft to fly low and slow directly over the target, perfect conditions for anti-aircraft gunners to shoot them down. Some Wildcats had no bombs at all, just their machine guns. A few aircraft had been fully rearmed between missions and actually carried proper anti-ship ordnance, torpedoes or armour-piercing bombs, but these were the minority. The pilots adapted. Those with general-purpose bombs dropped them anyway, hoping to score lucky hits on less armoured parts of the ships. Those with depth charges made their runs, accepting the terrible risks. Those with only machine guns strafed, knowing their bullets couldn't penetrate armour but might damage radar antennas, kill exposed personnel, or at least force the Japanese to take evasive action. And those with no weapons at all flew attack runs anyway, bluffing, hoping the Japanese wouldn't realise their bomb bays were empty until after they had forced the ships to manoeuvre. This combination of real attacks and fake attacks created an environment of constant threat that the Japanese found extremely difficult to manage. Admiral Kurita's ships had to treat every diving aircraft as a genuine threat. They couldn't know which planes carried torpedoes and which were bluffing. They had to manoeuvre to avoid apparent torpedo tracks, fire at every target, maintain air defense formations. All of this slowed their advance and prevented them from concentrating fire on the carriers. The American pilots developed tactics on the fly, literally making up doctrine in the middle of combat. Lieutenant Paul Garrison, flying a Wildcat from the Fanshawe Bay, realised that the Japanese gunners tracked diving aircraft by maintaining a constant rate of turn in their director sights. If the aircraft maintained a steady dive angle, the gunners could predict where it would be and fire ahead of it. Garrison started varying his dive angle randomly, sometimes steepening his dive, sometimes shallow, making himself an unpredictable target. He shared this technique over the radio, and other pilots adopted it immediately. This kind of tactical innovation, communicated in real time during combat, was only possible because the American pilots were well trained and trusted to think for themselves rather than rigidly following doctrine. The Japanese, by contrast, were following their doctrine too rigidly. Their anti-aircraft doctrine called for maintaining formation and concentrating fire on attacking aircraft. This worked well against organised strikes from fleet carriers, where waves of aircraft would approach from predictable directions at predictable altitudes. But Taffy 3's aircraft were attacking from all directions, at all altitudes, in no particular order. The Japanese would concentrate their fire on one group of attackers, only to have another group appear from a completely different direction. Their fire control systems, designed to track and engage bombers flying level at medium altitude, struggled to cope with fighters diving from high altitude or skimming in at wave-top height. By 7:45 a.m., the battle had been raging for an hour. The carriers had been under fire for most of that time, manoeuvring frantically to avoid shells. The Gambier Bay had been hit multiple times and was losing speed. The other carriers were launching and recovering aircraft in a continuous cycle, bringing planes back just long enough to reload them with ammunition or bombs, then sending them out again. Some pilots flew 4 or 5 sorties during the battle, landing just long enough to grab more ammunition before taking off again. The strain on the aircraft was enormous. The Wildcats and Avengers were designed for carrier operations, but carrier operations normally involved careful pre-flight checks, proper warm-up procedures, and time for maintenance between flights. The aircraft being launched from Taffy 3 that morning were often barely airworthy. Ensign Leonard Schoenemann flew a Wildcat with a damaged hydraulic system that meant his landing gear wouldn't retract. He flew the entire mission with his gear down, reducing his speed and making him more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire because there was no time to fix the problem. He attacked a cruiser, dropped his bombs, and landed back on the White Plains with battle damage from shrapnel. The plane handlers pushed his damaged aircraft to the side and launched another fighter from the same catapult. The coordination between different carrier air groups was minimal. Taffy 3 had 6 carriers, each with its own air operations officer trying to manage launches and recoveries while under fire. There was no overall air coordinator directing attacks or assigning targets. Pilots simply launched, climbed to altitude, looked for a target, attacked it, and returned. If they had fuel and ammunition left, they attacked again. This lack of coordination should have reduced effectiveness, but in the chaos of the battle it actually helped. The Japanese couldn't predict where the next attack would come from because the Americans didn't know themselves. The attacks appeared to be coming from everywhere because they were coming from everywhere. Some of the most effective attacks came from unlikely sources. The Composite Squadron VC-10 from the Gambia Bay was trained primarily for anti-submarine warfare. Their Avengers carried depth charges and their tactics emphasized low-altitude attacks against submarines. When they found themselves facing battleships, they applied their anti-submarine tactics to surface targets. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led his Avengers in a low-level attack on the heavy cruiser Chikuma, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously to split the cruiser's defensive fire. 2 depth charges hit close aboard the cruiser, the underwater explosions rupturing hull plates and damaging propeller shafts. The Chikuma's speed dropped and she began taking on water. She would eventually sink from accumulated damage. The attacking pilots noticed something else that proved crucial to the battle's outcome. The Japanese were maneuvering to avoid attacks, but their maneuvers were not coordinated across the entire formation. Each ship's captain was making independent decisions about how to avoid aircraft and torpedoes. This meant that instead of maintaining a tight formation that could concentrate fire, the Japanese ships were spreading out across miles of ocean. Some ships were turning north to avoid torpedo tracks. Others were turning south to pursue individual carriers. Some were zigzagging to throw off bomb runs. The formation that had approached in perfect order at dawn was now a scattered mess of individual ships, each fighting its own battle. This dispersion had another effect. It made the American force appear larger than it actually was. From the bridge of a Japanese cruiser, looking across miles of ocean dotted with smoke screens and maneuvering ships and aircraft, it was impossible to get an accurate count of how many carriers were present. The smoke screens, laid down by the carriers and their escorts, created walls of dense smoke that hid the ship's movements. A carrier might appear through the smoke, be identified and targeted, then disappear back into the smoke. Moments later, a carrier would appear in a different location. Was it the same carrier that had moved, or a different one? The Japanese couldn't tell. Kurita's staff estimated they were facing at least 10 carriers, possibly more. In reality, there were 6, but the smoke and confusion multiplied them in Japanese perception. The crew of the escort carrier St. Lo, which would later that day become the first ship sunk by a kamikaze attack, performed an extraordinary feat of damage control that saved their ship during the surface battle. At 7:50 a.m., an 8-inch shell from a Japanese cruiser penetrated the St. Lo's thin hull, passed through 3 compartments, and lodged in a berthing space without exploding. The shell was a dud, but it had started a fire. The damage control teams, led by Lieutenant Robert Becker, had to extinguish the fire while leaving the unexploded shell in place. They couldn't flood the compartment because that would affect the ship's stability. They couldn't move the shell because it might explode if jarred. They had to carefully spray it with foam to keep it cool while fighting the fire around it. They succeeded, saving the ship. The same ship would survive the surface battle, only to be destroyed by a kamikaze 6 hours later. But Becker's damage control team had given her those extra 6 hours of life. At 8 a.m., the tide began to turn, though no one realized it at the time. The Japanese cruiser Suzuya, hit by bombs from Avengers, suffered a catastrophic magazine explosion when fires reached her torpedo storage. The cruiser broke in half and sank in minutes, taking 300 of her crew with her. The cruiser Kumano, already damaged by a torpedo, was hit by several bombs that destroyed her bow. She could barely make headway and fell out of formation. The cruiser Tone, hit multiple times by machine gun fire and small bombs, had lost most of her topside anti-aircraft guns, and her fire control radar was damaged. She was still afloat, but her combat effectiveness was drastically reduced. More importantly, Admiral Kurita was receiving reports that convinced him his situation was desperate. His ships reported being under attack by hundreds of aircraft. They reported that the American carriers were still afloat despite taking hits. They reported American cruisers and destroyers attacking from multiple directions. Kurita's staff, trying to make sense of these reports, concluded that Center Force had blundered into a major American fleet. The carriers they could see were certainly not escort carriers, which should have been easily destroyed by now. They must be fleet carriers, heavily armoured and well defended. Where were their escorts? Where were the American battleships and cruisers that would normally protect carriers? Kurita assumed they were nearby, perhaps hidden by the smoke, preparing to trap his force. What Kurita didn't know was that there were no American battleships nearby. Halsey's battleships were hundreds of miles to the north, engaging the Japanese carrier force. The only American heavy ships in the area were 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, all of which had already committed themselves to desperate attacks, and several of which were sinking. But Kurita couldn't see through the smoke. He couldn't get accurate reconnaissance. All he knew was that his force was under continuous air attack, that several of his cruisers were damaged or sinking, and that the American carriers showed no signs of being destroyed. In his mind, trained by years of Japanese naval doctrine that emphasized caution when facing superior forces, these facts added up to a trap. At 8:23 a.m., Admiral Kurita made his decision. He ordered all ships to cease pursuit of the carriers and reform to the north. The order was transmitted by signal flags and radio. Ship captains who were closing in for the kill on the American carriers, who could see their targets clearly and were preparing to finish them off, could not believe the order. Some requested confirmation, others simply assumed there must be a mistake. But the order was repeated. Reform to the north, cease pursuit. The attack was being called off. Aboard the American carriers, the sudden withdrawal of the Japanese ships seemed impossible. 1 minute they had been under heavy fire, shells landing all around them, the Gambia Bay sinking and the other carriers expecting to follow her at any moment. The next minute the Japanese were turning away. Admiral Sprague, on the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, watched through his binoculars as the massive Japanese battleships executed a simultaneous turn to the north. He turned to his operations officer and said something that would be recorded in the ship's log. "I don't know why they're leaving, but I'm not going to question it. Keep the aircraft attacking, make them keep running." The pilots responded. Even those who were out of ammunition made mock attacks to keep the Japanese nervous. Lieutenant Robert Cosgrove, flying an Avenger with empty bomb racks and less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining, made 3 separate attack runs on a battleship, diving as if to drop bombs, then pulling away at the last second. The battleship manoeuvred to avoid each apparent attack. Cosgrove finally ditched his Avenger in the ocean when his fuel ran out, but he had contributed to the illusion that the Americans still had offensive capability. The reality was that Taffy 3 was on the verge of collapse. The Gambia Bay had sunk. The other carriers were all damaged to varying degrees. Ammunition was running low across the entire force. Many aircraft were damaged and barely flyable. The destroyers that had charged the Japanese were sinking or crippled. If Kurita had maintained his attack for another 30 minutes, he would have destroyed at least 2 more carriers and probably all of them. But he didn't know that. He only knew what his perception told him, and his perception was that he faced a larger force than he could defeat. So he withdrew, and in withdrawing, he turned a near-certain Japanese victory into a decisive American success. The aftermath of the battle was chaotic. Pilots who had been airborne for over an hour were running out of fuel. The carriers, damaged and still manoeuvring, could not safely recover aircraft. Some pilots diverted to other carriers in Taffy 2 and Taffy 1, task units that had been south of the battle and were now moving north to assist. Others ditched in the ocean, hoping to be picked up by destroyers or float planes. A few made it to airfields on Leyte, landing with empty tanks and shot-up aircraft. Ensign McGraw, who had ditched alongside the Heermann, was not alone. Over 30 pilots ditched their aircraft that morning, and most were rescued, though some spent hours in the water before being found. The human cost of the battle was staggering. The Gambia Bay sank with heavy loss of life. The destroyers Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts went down with hundreds of their crews. Survivors floated in the ocean for days in some cases, exposed to sharks, dehydration, and exposure. The final death toll for Taffy 3 exceeded 1,500 men, making it one of the costliest engagements for the US Navy in the Pacific War. But they had saved the landing beaches. The hundreds of transports and supply ships anchored in Leyte Gulf, filled with troops, ammunition, fuel, and supplies, had escaped destruction. If Kurita had reached those ships, the casualties would have been measured in tens of thousands. The battle's strategic impact reverberated throughout the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had committed its last significant surface force to the operation and had been turned back. They would never again attempt a major fleet action. The carriers that had served as bait for Halsey were destroyed in the Battle of Cape Engano, wiping out what remained of Japanese carrier forces. The southern force had been annihilated in Surigao Strait by American battleships in a classic naval engagement. Of the 4 separate battles that made up Leyte Gulf, the Japanese lost all 4. Center Force's withdrawal off Samar was the final blow to any hope of Japanese naval victory. Post-war analysis by military historians has consistently ranked the battle off Samar as one of the greatest examples of successful defense against superior forces in naval history. The numerical odds faced by Taffy 3 were worse than those faced by the British at Trafalgar or the Americans at Midway. Yet they prevailed through a combination of aggressive tactics, effective use of available weapons, and exploitation of enemy mistakes. The role of air power, even improvised and inadequate air power, was central to the victory. The pilots themselves never claimed to have won the battle single-handedly. They recognized the crucial role of the destroyers and destroyer escorts whose suicidal attacks had disrupted the Japanese formation. They acknowledged the skill of the carrier captains who had maneuvered their ships brilliantly under impossible conditions. They credited Admiral Sprague's leadership in keeping the force together and fighting effectively despite being outgunned. But they also knew that without the constant air attacks, the destroyer's sacrifice would have only delayed the inevitable, not prevented it. The aircraft had been the decisive weapon, not because they sank many Japanese ships, but because they created the perception of overwhelming American strength that caused Kurita to withdraw. Modern analysis using computer simulations has attempted to determine what would have happened if Kurita had continued his attack. The simulations consistently show that Taffy 3 would have been destroyed within 60 to 90 minutes if the Japanese had maintained their assault. The carriers would have been sunk one by one despite all their evasive maneuvers. But the simulations also show that the American aircraft, even with their inadequate weapons, would have inflicted significant damage on the Japanese force. Kurita would have lost at least half his cruisers and probably 1 or more battleships to accumulated air attacks. He would have won the tactical battle but lost so many ships that his force would have been unable to effectively bombard the landing beaches before American reinforcements arrived. In other words, Kurita's decision to withdraw, while it seemed like a defeat at the time, may have actually saved his fleet from destruction in a Pyrrhic victory. The veterans of Taffy 3 held reunions for decades after the war. The escort carrier sailors and the pilots who had flown from their decks maintained close bonds forged in those desperate hours off Samar. At their 50th reunion in 1994, the few remaining survivors gathered to remember their fallen comrades and to marvel at the fact that they had survived. Ensign McGraw, by then 72 years old and still flying crop dusters, was asked by a reporter what he thought was the most important factor in their survival. His answer was characteristically modest. "We didn't give up. That's really all it was." The Japanese had every advantage except one. They could quit. We couldn't. When you can't quit, you find ways to keep fighting. We found ways. Some of them worked. Enough of them worked. That's why we're here, and a lot of good men aren't. The battle off Samar stands as proof that in war, material superiority does not guarantee victory. The Japanese had better ships, bigger guns, more armour, and numerical advantage. They should have won easily. They lost because they faced an enemy that refused to accept defeat, that attacked with everything available even when logic said it was hopeless. And that convinced them through sheer ferocity that they faced something more dangerous than they actually did. The escort carriers and their Wildcats stopped the battleships through courage, improvisation, and the unwillingness to surrender. It was not the way naval battles were supposed to be won, but it worked. And in war, what works is what matters. The thunder of those Japanese guns has faded into history, but the roar of those Wright Cyclone engines and the chatter of those Browning machine guns still echoes in the annals of naval warfare as the sound of impossible victory.